He simply bought an old, rusty fridge at a garage sale without expecting anything strange, but when he opened it he realized something was hidden inside, something that forced him to urgently call the police. Subscribe and write in the comments which city or country you're watching this video from. The morning had that stillness that makes ordinary things feel deliberate. Sunlight lay flat across the identical rooftops of the neighborhood, reflecting off windshields and the metal edges of mailboxes. The lawns were already mowed, hoses neatly coiled against the garages, and the air carried a faint mix of fresh-cut grass and gasoline. It was the kind of suburb where weekends passed slowly and predictably, when nothing truly unexpected was supposed to happen. Caleb Turner drove without hurry, one hand resting lightly on the wheel of his old pickup. The truck rattled gently at low speed, a familiar sound he no longer noticed. The bed was half full of the tools he carried year-round. A dented toolbox, a coil of rope, a pair of work gloves hardened by years of use. He wasn't heading anywhere important. Saturdays like this were for wandering, for following cardboard signs with crooked arrows that read garage sale in uneven marker, for stopping only when something caught his eye. He had long ago learned not to rush on these mornings. Haste led to mistakes, to buying things he didn't need or overlooking the one object that might be worth something later. He made his living fixing what others had abandoned. Broken appliances, rusted frames, furniture with loose joints and bad reputations. He didn't romanticize it, but it paid the bills, kept his hands busy, and gave him a quiet sense of control. Things were simpler when you could see what was broken and understand how to make it work again. The sign that caught his attention barely held on, taped to a wooden post at the corner of a side street. The arrow pointed down a dead end. The lettering was faded, as if the sign had been reused many times. Caleb followed it, carefully turning the truck around a curve lined with tall maples and neatly trimmed hedges, until he saw the open garage at the end of the cul-de-sac and the small crowd gathered around folding tables. He parked at a polite distance and got out. The sun's heat already warmed the back of his neck. The sale looked like every other one. Cardboard boxes full of old clothes, mismatched plates on a tablecloth that had seen better days, a lamp with a cracked shade leaning against a portable cooler. A couple in their late 30s moved between the tables, smiling politely at passers-by and answering questions with the practiced ease of people who just wanted to empty the garage before the day grew too long. Caleb walked slowly, nodding to no one in particular. He picked up a wrench, tested its weight, set it down. He flipped through a stack of vinyl records without recognizing any names. Everything felt familiar, almost boring, and that was usually a good sign. It meant there was time to notice what others overlooked. Only when he reached the far edge of the driveway did he see it. The fridge stood apart from the rest of the sale, pushed close to the fence as if it didn't quite belong. Its white enamel had yellowed unevenly over the years, streaked with rust that bled downward from the chipped corners and exposed seams. The handle was pitted and dull. The surface of the door showed faint scratches suggesting it had been dragged more than once, more than lifted. It was an old model, the kind built to last decades longer than expected, but something about it made Caleb slow his steps. He walked around at once, hands in his pockets. At first glance it was just another dead appliance, too big and awkward for most people to bother with. But as he got closer he noticed details that didn't add up. The door seemed heavier than normal, hanging slightly off its hinges. Along the edge the metal had been welded in places where there shouldn't have been welds. The seams were uneven and crude, as if the work had been done in a hurry with no concern for appearance. He reached out and tugged gently on the handle. The door opened with resistance, not the loose swing of an old fridge, but something tighter, more deliberate. Inside, the shelves were gone. The interior walls seemed thicker than normal. The space was strangely shallow. Caleb rapped a knuckle against the inner panel. The sound was dull, dense, not hollow the way it should have been. "Does it work?" he asked, looking toward the couple near the tables. The man shrugged and offered half a smile. "Honestly, no idea. It was already here when we moved in. It's been in the garage the whole time." The woman added, "We figured someone might want it for parts or scrap." Caleb nodded, his attention returning to the fridge. "The previous owners left it, right?" The man said. "The house was a real mess when we bought it. There were a lot of old things we got rid of most, but this was heavy and didn't seem worth the effort." Caleb ran his fingers along the edge of the door, feeling the roughness of the metal. He noticed a faint outline where the manufacturer's plate had once been, now gone, filled in and painted over. That was odd. People didn't usually bother removing those. "How much?" he asked. The man smiled faintly. "Make an offer." Caleb thought for a moment and named a price so low it was almost insulting. The man didn't hesitate. "Deal," he said, as if relieved the fridge was finally someone else's problem. They shook hands and the transaction ended as quickly as it had begun. Caleb pulled a hand truck from the back of his pickup and maneuvered it into place. When he tilted the fridge forward, its weight surprised him. He leaned back, braced himself, and tensed his muscles as he guided it onto the hand truck. The mass felt wrong, too heavy for something that was supposed to be almost empty. As he rolled it toward the truck, one of the hand truck's wheels caught in a crack in the driveway. The fridge lurched sharply and a short, muffled thump came from inside. It wasn't the rattle of loose metal or the clink of forgotten parts, but a solid sound, like something striking well-packed fabric. Caleb froze for a fraction of a second. Both the man and woman looked over. The woman's smile faltered briefly before returning. "Careful," she said, "that thing's a beast." Caleb forced a smile, nodded, and pushed the fridge the rest of the way without a word. He secured it in the truck bed with ropes, tightening them until the appliance barely moved when he tested it. As he climbed back into the cab, he glanced in the side mirror. The couple stood at the end of the driveway, watching him leave longer than necessary. He told himself it was nothing. People always watched buyers. Curiosity to see if the junk they'd tripped over for years was finally worth something to someone. Still, the image stayed with him as he drove, the neighborhood sliding past in orderly rows of houses and trees. Back at his own driveway, Caleb unloaded the fridge alone, guiding it with careful movements into the open garage. The space smelled of oil and sawdust, familiar and comforting. He shut off the engine and stood for a moment in the sudden silence, listening to the ticking of the truck as it cooled. He rolled the fridge to the center of the garage, steadied it, and wiped the sweat from his forehead. Without really thinking, he placed a hand against the rear panel and gave it a light push. Again, that contained sound answered from inside. Caleb stepped back, studying the appliance under the harsh light of the bare bulb overhead. The rust, the welds, the missing label, the weight. Individually, none of it meant much. Together, they formed a pattern he didn't yet understand. He told himself he'd figure it out later. There was no reason to rush. He closed the garage door partway, leaving a strip of daylight at the bottom, and went inside to wash his hands. But even as he did, he felt a low, unfamiliar tension settle in his chest, the feeling that the quiet routine of his morning had already changed in a way he couldn't undo. When he returned to the garage and placed his palm once more against the side of the fridge, he felt a faint vibration beneath the metal, so subtle he might have imagined it. He held his breath and listened. The fridge remained silent and inert, as dead as it appeared. Still, Caleb didn't step away. He stood there in the dim garage, the half-closed door and the rusted appliance looming before him, and understood for the first time that he had brought home something that was never meant to be found. The fridge remained exactly where Caleb had left it, standing in the center of the garage like an accusation. Late morning light filtered through the narrow gap under the garage door, cutting a pale stripe across the concrete floor that stopped just short of its rusted base. Dust motes drifted lazily in the beam, settling on the chipped enamel and the faint scars where the metal had been worked and reworked by hands that weren't his. Caleb tried to continue the rest of the morning as if nothing had changed. He made coffee, drank it standing at the kitchen counter, stared out the window at his small backyard without really seeing it. The fridge invaded his thoughts in silent, persistent ways. Every time his mind wandered, it returned to the dull thump he had heard, to the unnatural weight of the door, to the absence of the manufacturer's plate where it should have been riveted. By the time he went back to the garage, the air inside had warmed, carrying the familiar smells of oil, old wood, and metal filings. He closed the garage door completely. This time the bang echoed briefly before the space fell into a deeper, more private silence. He stood still, listening, half expecting to hear something move inside the fridge. There was nothing. Only the faint hum of the house settling and the distant sound of a lawnmower somewhere down the street. He circled it slowly, hands clasped behind his back. Up close, the thing looked even stranger. The rust wasn't uniform. In some places it seemed natural, a slow decay of steel exposed for decades. In others it looked deliberate, almost painted on, as if someone had aged the appliance to make it appear older and more neglected than it really was. The welds on the rear panel were crude, uneven beads of metal made in haste rather than skill. They had been lightly sanded and then painted, but not enough for them to disappear completely. Caleb crouched and examined the bottom edge. The feet were uneven, one newer than the others, screwed in at a strange angle. He rocked it gently side to side. It barely moved. The weight seemed concentrated in the body rather than the compressor area, which made no sense for a normal appliance. He pressed his ear to the side panel and tapped lightly with his knuckle. The sound that returned was thick and muffled, as if the walls were filled with something solid. He straightened, exhaled through his nose. Maybe it had been modified for insulation. Maybe someone had reinforced it for cold storage. He had seen strange home projects before, things people built without knowing or caring how they should be done. This could be another example, an overbuilt relic from another era. He reached for the power cord loosely coiled near the base. It was old but intact, the rubber hardened by age. The plug, however, was newer. A modern replacement that didn't match the rest. Someone had gone to the trouble of keeping it functional at some point. Caleb hesitated, then plugged it into the wall outlet. The fridge responded with nothing. No hum, no vibration, no click of the compressor trying to start. It remained obstinately silent. He unplugged it again and let the cord fall to the floor. He opened the door and leaned inside, studying the interior more carefully. The walls were smooth, almost too smooth, and the corners were rounded in a way that reduced usable space. The back wall bulged slightly inward, reducing the depth of the cavity. He ran his hand over it, pressing hard. It didn't give at all. When he knocked from inside, the sound was the same dull thud as before. Caleb stepped back and closed the door. He felt a growing unease he couldn't name. He had brought home many strange things over the years, but this was different. There was an intentionality that bothered him. This wasn't a broken fridge someone had abandoned out of laziness. It had been altered, disguised, made to look worthless. He told himself again that he was overthinking it. Still, he took the flashlight from his toolbox and ran it along the seams of the rear panel. The light caught something thin and irregular where two sections of metal joined. It looked as if a secondary layer had been added over the original casing. He traced the seam with his finger, feeling the slight ridge beneath the paint. A knock sounded on the side door of the garage, so sharp and sudden it made him jump. He turned, heart in his throat, and waited a moment before answering. "Caleb, are you in there?" called a voice. It was Mrs. Donnelly from next door. Her voice carried easily through the thin door. Caleb let out his breath and crossed the garage to open it. She stood there with a grocery bag on one arm, her grey hair pulled into her usual bun. "Sorry to bother you," she said. "I saw your garage door earlier and thought I'd bring you some muffins I made. I had extras for just me." "Thanks," said Caleb, accepting the bag with a smile that felt slightly forced. "I appreciate it." Her gaze drifted past him to the fridge looming behind. "That's an old one," she commented. "They don't make them like that anymore." "I picked it up this morning," said Caleb. "At a garage sale." She nodded, then frowned slightly. "It looks heavy." "It is," he said. "Well," she said, adjusting her grip on her purse, "don't work too hard. It's supposed to get hot later." He watched her walk back to her house, then closed the door and bolted it. The click sounded louder than normal. The brief interruption had done nothing to calm his nerves. If anything, it had sharpened them. He returned to the fridge and placed both hands flat against the rear panel. He leaned in and pushed, testing. The appliance barely moved. He shifted his weight and pushed harder. Again, that muffled sound answered, deeper this time, as if something inside had shifted slightly and settled back. Caleb stepped away and wiped his hands on his jeans. He scanned the garage, suddenly aware of how exposed it was. The windows were small and high, but someone could see inside if they wanted. He considered covering them, then dismissed the idea that would only feed his growing paranoia. He decided to remove the rear panel. If there was nothing, he would know and could move on. If there was something, he would face it when he saw it. He grabbed his tools and got to work, unscrewing the visible screws along the edges of the panel. Some came out easily, others resisted, stripped and stubborn. He cursed under his breath and applied more force. When the panel finally loosened, it didn't come away cleanly. It stuck, as if something more than screws held it. He pried it up with a flathead screwdriver, working slowly so as not to bend the metal. The panel came free with a squeal and revealed a second surface underneath. Smoother, newer, and completely sealed. There was no compressor, no coils, none of the components he expected to see. Just a solid wall. Caleb stared, pulse racing. This was no fridge he had ever seen. He ran the flashlight over the surface. There were faint outlines where something rectangular had been welded shut. The metal showed scratches, shallow grooves left by tools. Someone had cut into that layer before and then sealed it again. The garage suddenly felt too quiet. Caleb became sharply aware of the sounds beyond its walls. A car passing on the street, the distant bark of a dog, the hum of an air conditioner kicking on nearby. Ordinary noises, but they made his isolation feel more pronounced. He struck the inner wall with the screwdriver. The sound that returned was dense and close, like hitting a safe. Caleb straightened slowly, mind racing. There was no reasonable explanation for this. Whatever was inside this fridge had not been meant for casual access. It had not been meant to be found at all. He thought of the couple at the sale. The way the man had shrugged when he asked if it worked, the way the woman's smile had faltered when the fridge moved and made that sound. He thought of the missing label, the deliberate rust, the extra weight. He considered stopping. He could put the panel back, roll the fridge into a corner, and forget it. He could even take it to the scrapyard and let someone else deal with it. The thought brought a brief wave of relief. Then his phone vibrated in his pocket. Caleb pulled it out and looked at the screen. An unknown number. He let it ring once, twice, 3 times, then silenced it. A moment later a voicemail notification appeared. He didn't listen. Not yet. He stood there, the fridge looming behind him, the phone heavy in his hand. The ordinary logic of his life, the small rules he followed to stay out of trouble, suddenly felt inadequate. He had crossed a line simply by bringing that thing into his garage, by noticing what others had ignored. Caleb set the phone on the workbench and picked up the flashlight again. He leaned closer to the sealed inner wall, tracing the faint rectangular outline with his fingers. Whatever was inside had been packed tightly, deliberately, and hidden with care. Outside, a car slowed as it passed his house. He heard the crunch of tires on gravel, then the sound faded. Caleb stepped back, breathing shallowly, and looked toward the garage door as if expecting it to open. It remained closed, solid, and unmoving. He was alone with the fridge and the growing certainty that he had stumbled onto something much bigger and more dangerous than a simple garage sale find. He turned off the overhead light and left the garage in darkness, the pale shape of the fridge barely visible. As he went inside the house, he locked the door behind him. The finality of the sound echoed in his ears. He knew he would not sleep easily that night. The fridge waited, silent and patient, guarding its secret just out of reach. Caleb didn't sleep. He lay on his back in the dark room, staring at the faint outline of the ceiling fan turning slowly above him, its soft click marking time more faithfully than any clock. Every creak of the house sounded amplified, every distant noise from the street filtered into his thoughts and transformed into something intentional. A passing car became a slow patrol. The whisper of wind against the siding sounded like footsteps stopping just outside. Sometime near dawn he stopped pretending he might rest and swung his legs over the side of the bed. The house felt unfamiliar in the early light, as if it had changed during the night. He made coffee he barely tasted and stood at the kitchen window until the sky lightened from grey to pale blue. When the sun finally rose, it brought no relief. Only clarity. Whatever was hidden inside that fridge wasn't going to disappear simply because he ignored it. He went to the garage as soon as the neighborhood began to wake, before curiosity or fear could dissuade him. The door rose with a mechanical groan and the smell of old metal greeted him. The fridge was exactly where he had left it, rear panel removed and the sealed wall exposed like a wound that refused to close. Caleb closed the garage door behind him and slid the bolt. He moved with deliberation now, not hurried but determined, as if the decision had already been made and his body was simply following instructions his mind had finally accepted. He put on thicker gloves, the heavy leather ones he used for sharp scrap, and laid out his tools on the bench with care. Screwdrivers, a pry bar, a small hammer, a cordless drill, and finally the angle grinder, unplugged from previous jobs. He stood in front of the fridge for a long moment, hands on his hips, studying the welded rectangle again. In daylight it was even clearer. The metal around the seam was slightly discolored, deformed just enough to reveal that it had been applied more than once. This was not factory work. Someone had cut into that cavity, sealed it, opened it again, and sealed it once more. That alone told him that whatever was inside had mattered enough to be checked. Caleb started with the least destructive option. He ran the drill along the seam, testing weak points, but the bit skated uselessly over the hard weld. He tried the pry bar next, sliding its edge into the narrow gap he could find and leaning his weight against it. The metal resisted stubbornly, bending only a fraction before springing back. He stepped away and wiped the sweat from his forehead. His heart was beating harder now, not from effort but from the constant realization that he was no longer simply investigating a strange appliance. He was forcing open something that had been deliberately sealed, something someone had once taken considerable effort to hide. The grinder roared to life with a sudden harsh noise in the confined space. Sparks flew as the disc bit into the metal, spraying the concrete floor with brief angry lights. Caleb worked slowly, tracing the outline of the rectangle and pausing often to let the metal cool and to listen. Every time he paused, the silence felt heavy and expectant. When the final cut was made, he shut off the grinder and stepped back, breathing hard. The rectangle did not fall on its own. He tapped it lightly with the hammer. It moved enough to confirm it was loose. Caleb hooked his fingers into the edge and pulled. The panel came free with a low grinding sound and a breath of air escaped from the cavity behind. The smell that followed was faint but unmistakable. A mix of old oil, dry fabric, and something else, something musty, trapped for too long. It was the smell of time caught and compressed. Inside the cavity, packed so tightly it seemed impossible they had fit, were several rectangular packages stacked with careful precision. They were wrapped in thick yellowish fabric, each layer darkened by oil and sealed along the edges with hardened wax. The packages were arranged like bricks, no wasted space, no room for movement. Caleb stared, mind momentarily blank. This was no casual hiding place, this was long-term storage. Deliberate. He reached in and touched the nearest package. It was solid, heavier than it looked. He pulled it from the cavity and set it gently on the workbench, as if a sudden movement might damage it or trigger something invisible. The fabric crinkled slightly under his fingers, stiff with age. He stood there for several seconds, simply looking at it. Part of him expected an alarm to sound, or the garage door to rattle, or his phone to ring again. None of that happened. The house remained silent. Caleb picked up a utility knife and carefully cut along the wax seam. The blade met resistance at first, then slid through with a soft tearing sound. He peeled the fabric layer by layer until the contents were revealed. The sight took his breath away. Inside was a tight bundle of paper, the edges perfectly aligned. It was wrapped again in a thin oilskin that he peeled away with trembling fingers. When the paper was finally exposed, he recognized it immediately, even before he saw the markings. Money. Not modern bills, not the colorful polymers he occasionally handled, but old paper currency, thick and cream-colored, with ornate designs and seals he had only seen in photographs. The ink was dark and crisp, the paper surprisingly fresh. These were not random old bills stuffed in a drawer. They had been preserved. Caleb lifted the bundle and felt its weight, real and undeniable. He turned the top bill just enough to glimpse the serial number, then stopped. His hands were shaking now. He set the money on the bench and leaned against it, trying to control his breathing. This was no longer something he could explain as a strange DIY project or an accidental stash. This was serious. This was criminal. He looked again toward the garage door, half expecting the knob to turn. Nothing moved. Caleb turned his attention back to the cavity and carefully pulled out another package, then another, arranging them in an orderly row on the bench. Each was identical in size and weight, each wrapped with the same obsessive care. There were more than he had expected, enough that the total amount of money, whatever it was significant beyond anything he had ever handled. At the back of the cavity, behind the packages, he noticed something different. A thinner package wrapped in fabric, but without the same rigid structure. He reached in and pulled it out. This one was lighter. When he opened it, he found folded papers, the edges brittle with age. There were several items. Yellowish typewritten documents on thin paper, handwritten notes in careful script, and a small bundle of black and white photographs held by a rusted clip. Caleb picked up the photographs first. They showed people, places, moments frozen in time. A man standing beside an old car, his face partly shadowed, a woman holding a child, her expression caught between a smile and something more cautious, a rural road stretching into the distance, marked on the back with a pencil date. The dates stopped him cold. They were ancient, not decades but nearly a century old. He set the photographs aside and unfolded the documents. The typography was formal, precise. He immediately recognized part of the language. References to deposits, transfers, certificates. This was not a diary or personal correspondence, it was official financial documentation, the kind of paperwork that left trails people tried hard to erase. At the bottom of the stack was a thicker sheet of paper folded. Caleb opened it slowly, heart beating harder with each movement. It was a map. Not printed, but hand-drawn, detailed and meticulous. Lines traced roads and waterway symbols marked landmarks, margin notes referenced distances and directions, some crossed out and rewritten. This was no simple sketch, it was a working document, refined and corrected over time. Caleb spread it flat on the bench and studied it. He didn't immediately recognize any of the places, but the style was unmistakable. Whoever had drawn it knew exactly what they were doing. The map was meant to lead someone to a specific place using clues only the intended reader would understand. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the garage. Money, documents, photographs, a map. This was a package of evidence, not a random collection of valuables. Someone had hidden not only wealth, but information. Caleb stepped back and looked again at the fridge, now gutted and silent. The appliance suddenly seemed less an object and more a message. It had been designed to disappear into the background, to sit unnoticed in garages and basements, passing from one owner to another without questions. It was the perfect hiding place because no one looked twice at an old fridge. His phone vibrated again. The sound made him jump. He pulled it from his pocket and looked at the screen. The same unknown number. This time a text message followed immediately after the missed call. "Did you find what you were looking for?" Caleb's mouth went dry. He read the message again, hoping he had misunderstood. The words didn't change. He didn't reply. Instead, he turned the phone off and set it face down on the bench, away from the packages as if distance alone could protect him. His mind raced, trying to understand how someone could know what he was doing, how curiosity had turned so quickly into exposure. He moved with sudden urgency, returning the money packages to the cavity with all the care he could. He didn't reseal it, but covered the opening with the removed panel and propped it to hide the view. He gathered the documents and photographs, put them in a cardboard box, and hid it under the bench behind cans of paint and scrap wood. Only the map he kept out. He folded it and slipped it into the pocket of his jacket without fully understanding why. Something in him felt different. Dangerous, yes, but also essential. He turned off the overhead light and stood in the dim garage, the fridge reduced once more to a shadowy shape. His hands were still shaking. The ordinary logic of his life had shattered completely, replaced by a raw, undeniable truth. What he had discovered had not ended with him. He locked the garage door and returned to the house, closing the windows and listening for unfamiliar sounds. When he finally sat at the kitchen table, the sun was high enough to cast sharp shadows on the floor. The outside world continued as if nothing had changed. Caleb rested his forearms on the table and lowered his head, breathing slowly and deliberately. He understood now that the fridge was not the end of the mystery. It was the beginning. The money and documents were pieces of something unfinished, something that had waited patiently for decades until the curiosity of one man had brought it back into the light. And whoever had sent that message was not willing to let it stay buried. Caleb spent the rest of that day moving through his house as if it no longer fully belonged to him. Every familiar object seemed subtly altered by what he now knew was hidden just a few steps away in the garage. The fridge, once just an awkward lump of rusted metal, had become something entirely different. It was no longer an appliance, it was a container of history, of crime, of decisions made by people who had believed they were clever enough to outlast the consequences. He didn't turn his phone back on. Instead, he focused on the documents he had taken out. The box that had been under the bench now rested on the dining table in front of him. He waited until nightfall, until the ordinary rhythms of the neighborhood softened. Porch lights came on one by one. Somewhere down the street a television flickered behind drawn curtains. Only then did he carry the box inside, closing the door behind him with deliberate care. He spread the contents slowly, piece by piece, as if order alone could hold the panic at bay. First, the photographs. He studied them under the bright kitchen light, turning them over to read the faint pencil marks on the back. Dates, initials, brief notations that meant nothing to him yet but felt loaded with intent. The people in the photos looked back at him from another era, their expressions unaware that their images would one day resurface in a stranger's kitchen. One photograph held his attention longer than the others. It showed a man standing near a road, fedora pulled low over his forehead, one hand resting on the roof of a dark sedan. The background was blurry, but Caleb could make out trees and what looked like a dirt road disappearing into the distance. On the back, written in careful script, were 2 letters and a date from the early 1930s. No name, only a marker, as if whoever had written it needed only enough information to remember. The documents came next. Caleb handled them carefully, aware of how fragile the paper had become. He read slowly, piecing meaning from language that felt both formal and deliberately vague. There were references to certificates, to values represented rather than possessed, to guarantees backed by institutions that no longer existed. These were not casual records, they were instruments of trust designed to move large sums of money silently, efficiently, and with minimal scrutiny. He stopped when he reached a page stamped with a seal he recognized not from personal experience but from history books and old newsreels. Gold certificates. The term echoed in his mind, heavy with implications. These were bills backed by real gold, issued in an era when money carried a different weight, both literal and symbolic. He turned the page and saw serial numbers printed in precise black ink. Caleb felt a tightness in his chest. Even without checking them, he understood that those numbers mattered. They were identifiers, threads that could be traced through archives and ledgers back to moments of exchange someone had wanted forgotten. He leaned back in the chair and looked at the spread of papers, suddenly acutely aware of how dangerous knowledge could be. He hadn't just found money, he had found a story, one that had been deliberately interrupted. The map lay folded at the edge of the table, untouched until now. Caleb hesitated before opening it again, as if prolonging the moment might somehow soften what it would reveal. When he finally unfolded it, the paper crinkled softly. The sound was unsettlingly loud in the silent kitchen. He spread it flat and leaned in, tracing the lines with his eyes. The map was more complex than he had first thought. It was not a single route but a network of paths, some emphasized, others crossed out and replaced. Landmarks were indicated not with names but with symbols. A triangle near a bend in a river, a circle at a road intersection. Brief margin notes referenced distances measured in steps rather than miles. Caleb didn't immediately recognize any of the places, but something in the layout felt deliberate, systematic. This was no treasure map drawn for drama, it was functional. It assumed the reader already knew the terrain, that the symbols would trigger memory rather than discovery. He stood and took a magnifying glass from a drawer, an old tool he occasionally used for fine repair work. Under the lens, the map revealed even more detail. Tiny numbers almost invisible to the naked eye added near certain points, corrections made, ink overwritten where someone had reconsidered a route or adjusted a distance. This map had been used more than once. Caleb folded it again and set it aside, thoughts racing. He needed context. He needed to know what he was dealing with before making any decisions. Against his better judgment, he turned the phone back on. It vibrated immediately, lighting up with notifications. Missed calls, text messages, all from the same unknown number. His stomach tightened as he scrolled through them. The messages were brief, almost polite, but carried an unmistakable edge. You bought something that wasn't meant to be sold. People are still looking for it. You don't want to make a mistake. Caleb blocked the phone and set it face down on the table. His hands were cold, now his pulse steady. This was no longer an abstract danger. Someone knew about the fridge. Someone knew it had been opened. He considered calling the police right then. The thought came with a wave of relief followed immediately by doubt. He had handled evidence, forced open a hidden compartment, touched money that was almost certainly tied to a crime. How would that look? Would they believe he was just a curious buyer, or would he become the most convenient suspect in a case that had waited decades to pin on someone? He needed to know more. Caleb spent the next hours cross-referencing what he could without leaving too many digital footprints. He searched broadly, avoiding specific serial numbers and focusing instead on historical events tied to gold certificates and large-scale ransom cases from the early 1930s. The results stunned him. One case kept reappearing, mentioned in fragments across old articles and academic discussions. A high-profile kidnapping that had shocked the nation, a massive ransom paid in gold-backed bills. The crime had been partially solved, the main perpetrators caught and punished, but a portion of the money had never been recovered. Investigators had suspected an accomplice, someone who had diverted a share and disappeared quietly. Caleb leaned back in the chair, mind buzzing. He didn't need confirmation, he felt the weight of the connection. The timeline matched. The type of money matched. The deliberate hiding of documents and a map suggested preparation, paranoia, and a long-term plan to survive betrayal. The fridge now made sense in a deeply unsettling way. It was portable, innocuous, the perfect disguise for something meant to be moved, hidden, and eventually recovered. Whoever had built it had understood human behavior as well as mechanics. People ignored old appliances, they passed them without question. Caleb's gaze drifted to the window, where his own reflection stared back. He looked older than he had that morning, his eyes shadowed by exhaustion and something closer to fear. He realized then that his life had already begun to fracture along invisible lines. Even if he turned everything over to the authorities tomorrow, there would be no way to erase what he had seen or the choices he had already made. A sound outside pulled him back to the present. Gravel crunching under tires. A car slowed near his house. He rose silently and approached the window. Peering through a narrow slit in the blinds, a dark sedan sat idling at the curb, engine running. The driver remained inside, face obscured by shadow. After a moment that stretched uncomfortably long, the car pulled away and disappeared down the street. Caleb exhaled shakily and stepped back from the window. His decision crystallized in that moment. He couldn't sit waiting for this to resolve itself. Nor could he go blindly to the police without understanding the full scope of what he had found. He returned to the table and picked up the map again, holding it with renewed focus. Whatever this was, whatever danger it represented, the map was the key. It pointed to a specific place, to somewhere the people contacting him still believed mattered. Caleb folded the map carefully and slipped it into a manila envelope. He gathered the photographs and documents and returned them to the box, hiding it once more under the bench in the garage. He paused there, listening, before replacing the inner panel over the cavity in the fridge. He didn't seal it, he only covered it for now. When he finally went to bed that night, sleep came in short, uneasy stretches. His dreams were filled with images of rusted metal and paper marked with numbers that refused to stay still. By morning his course was set. He wouldn't run. He wouldn't confront directly whoever was watching him. He would follow the map and, in doing so, step fully into the unfinished story that had been waiting, hidden in plain sight, for nearly a century. Caleb woke before dawn with the taste of metal in his mouth and the feeling that he had already been running for hours. For several seconds he lay motionless, listening to the house breathe around him, cataloguing every sound until it settled into the ordinary. No footsteps, no doors, no engines idling outside. Only the low hum of the kitchen fridge, the ticking of a distant clock, the far-off bark of a dog announcing nothing in particular. It took effort to remind himself where he was and what he had decided. The map, the documents, the money hidden behind a welded steel wall in his garage. The messages had stopped just short of a threat, but they carried one anyway. He rose slowly, careful not to turn on lights too early. The sky outside was still dark, the neighborhood reduced to silhouettes and faint porch bulbs. He made coffee and drank it sitting at the table, the manila envelope and map resting in front of him like a sleeping animal. He didn't open it yet. He already knew what it contained. What he needed now was confirmation, context, something solid enough to anchor his next move. By mid-morning he had locked himself into a routine designed to look normal from the outside. He showered, dressed, stepped out briefly to collect the mail. A neighbor waved, he waved back. The performance felt hollow but necessary. Whoever was watching him, if anyone was, would notice a sudden change in behavior. Caleb had no intention of giving them that satisfaction. When he finally sat in front of the computer, he did so carefully. First he cleared the browser history, shut the machine down and restarted it, as if that could somehow reset the danger along with the software. He knew it was useless, but rituals had a way of calming the mind. He began searching public information broadly, avoiding names and numbers. He read about the era, about how money moved in the early 20th century, about crimes that had shaped policy and paranoia alike. Again and again he found himself returning to the same infamous kidnapping, to the same unresolved questions. The article spoke of a ransom paid under intense pressure, of marked bills meant to catch the criminals, of a portion of the money that had vanished as if the earth had swallowed it. One article buried deep in an archive mentioned a hand-drawn map found among the belongings of a suspected accomplice who had died before he could be questioned. The map had been dismissed as meaningless, too vague to act on, its symbols indecipherable without context. It had been catalogued, photographed, and eventually forgotten. Caleb stared at the screen, pulse quickening. He didn't need to see the image to know. The description alone was enough. A hand-drawn map, symbols instead of names, corrections in ink. He closed the browser abruptly, as if the information itself were dangerous. His hands were shaking now, not exactly from fear but from a growing sense of inevitability. This was no coincidence. The fridge, the documents, the map, the messages were threads of the same fabric, stretched across decades. His phone vibrated on the desk. Caleb didn't touch it. At first he watched it vibrate, the screen lighting up with another message from the same unknown number. When it stopped, he picked it up slowly and read, "You took too long." A second message followed almost immediately. "That never ends well." Caleb set the phone down and leaned back in the chair, staring at the ceiling. Whoever it was, they were growing impatient. That meant they believed something was still accessible, still recoverable. It also meant they didn't have it yet. The thought brought no comfort. He stood and paced the room, measuring his steps. He considered calling a lawyer, then dismissed it. He considered driving straight to the nearest police station with an open confession ready. The image flickered and faded. He wasn't ready to relinquish control completely. Not yet. He needed to understand the map, to know what it pointed to and where it would lead. Going himself would either help or destroy him. Caleb returned to the table and opened the envelope. He spread the map carefully, smoothing the creases. In daylight, its details seemed sharper, more intentional. He traced the main route with his finger, following lines that suggested roads since renamed or erased. He compared it with modern satellite images, rotating the map slightly, adjusting scale and orientation until patterns began to emerge. It took hours. By early afternoon, he had identified a general region. An area several hours' drive away, far from his neighborhood but not unreachable. The landmarks were subtle, the kind that would only make sense to someone familiar with the land. A bend in a river that had since been rerouted, a crossing that no longer existed, replaced by a highway interchange miles beyond. One mark stood out above the others. A small triangle drawn in heavier ink, positioned near what appeared to be an old railroad line. Beside it, a tight note referenced a distance measured not in miles but in minutes. Caleb leaned back, exhausted. This was not a place someone would find by chance. It was a destination reached by intention. He looked at his phone again. No new messages. That worried him more than the threats. The silence suggested calculation. That afternoon he drove to the hardware store on the pretext of needing supplies. He bought nothing he didn't already have, nothing that seemed suspicious. On the way back he took a longer route, watching the mirrors carefully. Twice he thought he saw the same dark sedan in the distance, but each time it disappeared before he could be sure. At home he packed a small backpack, not as if he were leaving forever, but enough for a day trip. Water, gloves, a flashlight, a folding shovel he kept for gardening. He didn't pack a weapon. The thought crossed his mind, lingered, then passed. If things came to that, he doubted it would matter. As the afternoon wore on, he stood in the garage one last time, looking at the fridge. He touched the metal briefly, feeling the cold seep into his palm. It was strange to think that something so ordinary had become the axis around which his life now turned. He didn't take the documents or the money that seemed a line he still wasn't ready to cross. Instead, he photographed the map from multiple angles, then returned the original to the envelope and hid it again. If he didn't come back, at least there would be a record. Just before sunset his phone vibrated again. "Don't go alone." Caleb stared at the message for a long time, mind racing. It wasn't an order, it was advice or a warning or maybe a test. He didn't reply. He left the house as darkness settled, closing the door behind him with deliberate care. As he drove away, the streetlights came on one by one, illuminating a neighborhood that would sleep in peace, unaware of the history and danger slipping silently past. The road ahead stretched long and uncertain, and Caleb understood with a clarity bordering on dread that whatever waited at the end of the map's path would not be willing to remain buried. The road leaving the city felt longer than it should, as if the distance itself had decided to stretch. Caleb drove with both hands on the wheel, posture rigid, eyes moving constantly between the dark ribbon of asphalt ahead and the rearview mirror. The sky was heavy with low clouds that swallowed the last traces of daylight and compressed the world into a narrower, more uncertain shape. Each mile marker passed like a silent countdown. He had chosen not to leave in the middle of the night. Something about that felt too much like fleeing. Instead, he had waited until the hour when traffic thinned but had not disappeared completely, when his departure could still be explained as ordinary. Still, the act of leaving carried weight. Each turn took him farther from the small controlled space of his life and deeper into a story that no longer belonged to the past. Caleb kept the radio low. The murmur of voices and music served as a fragile anchor to normalcy. He wasn't listening to the words. His mind was occupied with the map, its lines and symbols replaying behind his eyes. He had memorized it as best he could. The triangle near the old railroad line, the distances measured in minutes, the subtle corrections that suggested trial and error. Whoever had drawn it had not trusted memory alone. They had expected to return. The first hour passed without incident. Then the road narrowed. Houses grew scarce until they were replaced by long stretches of dark fields and clusters of trees that leaned inward like silent observers. Caleb checked the mirrors again and saw headlights far behind. At first they seemed harmless. Another car moving at a similar pace. But when he changed lanes and the headlights followed, a thin line of unease tightened in his chest. He told himself not to overreact. People shared roads, coincidences happened. Still, when he took an exit he didn't strictly need and the car followed, the unease sharpened into something colder. Caleb's pulse quickened. He adjusted his speed slightly, then more deliberately. The car behind matched it, keeping the distance without closing it. The headlights never wavered. They were patient. He considered stopping, forcing a confrontation in a public place, but the exit had taken him to a quieter road flanked by dark trees and occasional reflectors that flashed briefly in his peripheral vision. There were no gas stations, no restaurants glowing invitingly in the darkness. Only the road, the trees, and the constant presence behind. After several minutes he slowed and signaled, turning onto a narrow secondary road that branched off like an afterthought. Gravel crunched under the tires. For a moment the headlights behind disappeared and he felt a wave of relief so strong it left him dizzy. Then the headlights reappeared, turning onto the same road. Caleb exhaled slowly, forcing his grip on the wheel to remain steady. Panic wouldn't help now. He drove down the road through sparse woods. The canopy overhead blocked what little light the moon might have offered. The map had led him this way for a reason. He only hoped that reason wouldn't end with him alone on a dark road. Ahead, the trees thinned and the road opened into a wide gravel clearing. An old sign stood at the edge, its lettering faded beyond recognition. Beyond it, barely visible, ran the raised embankment of an abandoned railroad line. The tracks had long since been removed, but the shape of the route was still clear against the earth. Caleb slowed and entered the clearing, turned off his headlights and coasted to a stop. For a moment there was only darkness and the ticking of his engine as it cooled. He waited, listening. The other car did not follow him into the clearing. Instead it slowed on the road, headlights sweeping briefly across the open space, then continued and disappeared among the trees beyond. The sudden absence felt almost as unsettling as the pursuit. Caleb waited another 4 minutes before moving. When he finally stepped down from the truck, the air was cool and damp, carrying the scent of earth and decaying leaves. He grabbed his flashlight and swept the beam across the clearing, revealing only scattered stones and the ghostly outline of the railroad embankment rising beyond. He climbed the embankment slowly, boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. At the top he stopped and turned off the flashlight, letting his eyes adjust. The landscape was silent in a way that felt deliberate, as if sound itself had been muffled. No insects, no distant traffic, only the faint whisper of wind through the leaves. Caleb pulled out his phone and opened the photograph of the map. He oriented himself, counting steps exactly as the notes indicated, moving carefully, aware of how easily a misstep could erase the trail completely. The minutes marked on the map were not literal time, he realized, but distance measured by walking, by human movement across uneven terrain. He reached the spot exactly when the map suggested. At first it seemed to be nothing at all. A shallow depression in the ground half hidden by brush, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. Caleb crouched and brushed away leaves and dirt with gloved hands. His fingers struck something solid. He cleared more debris, revealing the edge of a concrete slab, weathered and cracked. It was small, no larger than a manhole cover, and partially sunk into the earth. A metal ring protruded from one side, rusted but intact. Caleb sat back on his heels, heart pounding. This was it. Or part of it. He hesitated, scanning the surrounding area once more before gripping the ring and pulling. The slab resisted at first, then moved with a groan of protesting metal and stone. Caleb leaned his weight until the slab tilted and fell aside with a dull thud. Beneath was darkness. He aimed the flashlight down the beam cut through the blackness to reveal a narrow concrete shaft descending several feet into the earth. At the bottom something metallic gleamed faintly. Caleb swallowed and lowered himself carefully, bracing against the sides. The air grew cooler as he descended, heavy with the smell of damp concrete and old rust. When his boots touched bottom, he swept the light around and felt a jolt of recognition. There was a container, not large but unmistakable. A heavy metal box, its surface dented and gouged. A padlock hung open and useless from one corner. It had been forced at some point. The metal band was bent inward. Caleb approached slowly and shone the light inside. The box was empty. He stared inside for a long moment, mind struggling to reconcile the absence with everything that had led him there. The map. The fridge. The messages. The pursuit. This place should have contained something. It should have been the answer. Instead, it was proof. Someone had been here before him. Someone had followed the map, or their own version of it, and taken whatever had once been stored here. The emptiness was not failure, it was confirmation that the map was real, that the contents of the fridge were part of a larger system. Caleb climbed back up and stood in the clearing, the flashlight beam trembling slightly in his hand. His phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw a new message. "You're standing in the right place." A second message followed. "You should have stayed home." Before Caleb could reply, headlights flared at the edge of the clearing. A car entered slowly, deliberately, engine idling low. Caleb turned, heart hammering, and took a step back. The car stopped several meters away. The driver's door opened and a figure stepped out, remaining in shadow. Caleb didn't run. He stood firm, the cold night air filling his lungs and the weight of everything he had discovered pressing down on him. He understood now that this was no longer about curiosity or even survival. It was about control, about who possessed the final pieces of a story that refused to stay buried. The figure spoke. The voice was calm and unhurried, carrying easily across the clearing. "You weren't supposed to come alone." Caleb tightened his grip on the flashlight, its beam flickering between them. The unfinished business of the past had finally caught up with him, and there would be no stepping back from what came next. The man didn't approach immediately. He stayed near the car, one hand resting casually on the open door, his posture relaxed in a way that felt practiced rather than natural. The headlights remained on, lighting him from behind so his face remained unreadable, reduced to a silhouette edged in pale glow. The clearing seemed to shrink around them, the trees forming a dark wall that pressed inward. Caleb's mind raced through possibilities, none good. Run and he would be visible, slow on uneven ground. Fight and he would be at a disadvantage before he even understood the rules. Talk and risk saying the wrong thing. He chose the only option that bought time. "I didn't know I needed company," Caleb said, his voice steadier than he felt. The man laughed softly. "People never do. That's usually how they end up in trouble." He took a few steps forward, just enough for the light to catch part of his face. He was older than Caleb had expected. Late 50s perhaps, with grey at the temples and lines around the eyes that spoke of expressions controlled by habit. He wore ordinary clothes. Jeans and a jacket that could have belonged to anyone. There was nothing overtly threatening about him, and that was what made him dangerous. "You've been busy," the man continued, opening things that stayed closed for a very long time. Caleb felt a surge of anger beneath his fear. "If you know so much," he said, "then you know I didn't steal anything. I bought a fridge at a garage sale." Everything else followed. The man nodded slowly, as if conceding a point in a private debate. "That's true," he said. "You didn't steal it. That doesn't mean it was ever meant to be yours." The implication hung between them, heavy and deliberate. Caleb looked past the man toward the car, half expecting to see another figure emerge. No one did. "What do you want?" Caleb asked. "For you to stop," the man answered without hesitation. "You've seen enough. You've proven the map was real. That should satisfy your curiosity." "And the messages," Caleb said. "Following me, that's just concern for your well-being." The man smiled faintly. "It's the same reason the fridge existed in the first place." Caleb's grip tightened on the flashlight. "You're connected to this," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," the man said, in a way that doesn't benefit from official attention. For a moment neither spoke. The night pressed the silence, punctuated only by the distant creak of trees moving in the wind. Caleb realized then that the man was not there to negotiate, he was there to evaluate, to decide how big a problem Caleb really was. "What happens now?" Caleb asked. The man studied him carefully. That depends on what you do next. Before Caleb could answer, the distant sound of engines cut through the quiet. Not one, but several. Headlights flickered through the trees on the far side of the clearing, moving fast and with purpose. The man's expression changed instantly. The relaxed calm vanished, replaced by something sharper, more alert. He turned his head slightly, listened, and then cursed under his breath. "That's unfortunate," he said. The vehicles burst into the clearing moments later, red and blue lights flashing violently against the darkness. Tires skidded on gravel doors, slammed voices shouted orders that echoed off the trees. "Police! Hands where we can see them!" Caleb froze. Shock flooded him. He hadn't called them. He hadn't had time. And yet there they were, suddenly and overwhelmingly. The man near the car reacted faster than Caleb could process. He stepped back, hands raised just enough to appear compliant. His face had already shifted to a mask of confusion and mild irritation. "Easy," he said calmly. "What is this about?" The officers moved with practiced precision, weapons drawn, blinding lights. One grabbed Caleb's arm, pulling him away from the pit and toward a patrol car. Another forced the man to the ground, cuffing him quickly. Caleb's heart hammered as he was guided aside. His flashlight was taken from his hand and fell onto the gravel. An officer shone a light in his face. "Sir, are you hurt?" The officer asked. "No," Caleb said. "I'm fine." "Did this man threaten you?" Caleb hesitated, looking toward where the man was being searched. Their eyes met briefly and Caleb saw something flicker there. Not fear, calculation. "He followed me," Caleb said carefully. "He's been sending me messages." He knew about this place. The officer nodded, already signaling another to secure the area. More lights illuminated the clearing now, revealing details Caleb had overlooked earlier. Fresh tire tracks, footprints near the pit that weren't his. Within minutes the scene transformed into controlled chaos. Evidence markers appeared. Officers spoke into radios, their voices clipped and efficient. Someone photographed the open pit and the empty container below. A senior officer approached Caleb. His expression was serious but measured. "You're going to have to come with us," he said. "We have questions. A lot of them." Caleb didn't argue. He felt drained. The adrenaline was fading fast as he was led to the patrol car. He had one last glimpse of the man being placed in another vehicle. He didn't look back. The ride to the station passed in a blur of fragmented thoughts. Caleb replayed the night in his head. The map, the pursuit, the confrontation. He wondered who had called the police and why now. Had the man miscalculated? Had someone else been watching them? At the station, the questions started almost immediately. They took him to a small interview room, bare except for a table and 2 chairs. An officer brought him water and then left him alone for several minutes that felt much longer. When the door finally opened, 2 investigators entered. One older, one younger, both carrying thick folders of papers. They introduced themselves and went straight to the point. "Tell us about the fridge," the older investigator said. Caleb took a deep breath and started from the beginning. A garage sale, the weight, the welded panel, the money, and documents. He spoke slowly, carefully, leaving nothing out. He described the messages, the map, the decision to follow it. The investigators listened without interrupting, occasionally exchanging glances or taking notes. When he finished, the younger investigator slid a photograph across the table and showed a bundle of old bills spread under fluorescent light, evidence tags attached. "Do these look familiar?" she asked. Caleb nodded. "Yes. Gold certificates," the older investigator said. "The serial numbers match a list from a 1932 kidnapping ransom." The words settled heavily in the room. "We've been looking for those bills for decades," he continued. "They were marked, registered. Most of the ransom was recovered. Not all." Caleb swallowed. "The map?" he asked. The younger investigator leaned forward. "That map fills the gap we could never close. We believe it leads to the original drop site or one of them, a place where a portion of the money was diverted." "And the man?" Caleb asked. The older investigator's expression hardened. "He's connected, not directly to the original crime, but to its aftermath. Family inheritance. People who spent their lives protecting something they didn't even earn." Caleb leaned back. Exhaustion washed over him. "What happens to me?" "You're a witness," the investigator said. "A crucial one. You did the right thing by coming here, even if you didn't realize it. Caleb thought of the messages, the pursuit, the man's quiet confidence. I didn't think you'd show up, he had said. No, the investigator agreed. Neither did someone else. Someone else tipped us off. An anonymous call gave your name, your vehicle, and the location. Caleb frowned. Who? The investigator shook his head. We don't know yet. The implication hung suspended. The story had not ended. Someone else still held pieces of it. They kept Caleb at the station until morning, taking a formal statement, photographing his hands, cataloguing his belongings. He was treated with professional courtesy, but the gravity of the situation never diminished. When they finally released him, the sun was rising, casting long shadows across the parking lot. An officer walked him to his truck. You should be careful, she said quietly. People don't like losing things they've protected for a long time. Caleb nodded, too tired to answer. As he drove home, the world felt altered, sharper at the edges. The empty roads, the early morning light, the ordinary rhythm of life resuming everything felt unreal. He knew his involvement had not ended with one night in the woods. It had only changed shape. When he pulled into his driveway, he noticed immediately that something was wrong. The garage door was slightly ajar. His stomach tightened as he parked and approached cautiously. Inside, the fridge was still there, but the space around it had been disturbed. Boxes shifted, tools moved. A cardboard panel he had used to conceal the cavity lay on the floor. They had been here. Caleb stood in the silent garage, letting that realization settle over him. The police now had one piece of the story. He had another. And somewhere, unseen, someone else still had an interest in how it would end. He closed the garage door slowly, knowing the past had reached into his life and would not let go easily. The garage felt different now, emptied of its illusion of privacy. Caleb stood just inside the door for a long time without moving, his eyes adjusting to the familiar space that no longer felt familiar at all. The fridge rose against the far wall, silent and inert, yet carrying more weight than ever. It was no longer simply the object that had started everything. It was evidence, history, and a reminder that chance had a way of choosing its witnesses without warning. He didn't touch anything at first. The police had already been there once, but any intrusion that had occurred while he was away had not been official. That was obvious. The tools were out of place in subtle ways. Nothing overturned or destroyed, just shifted enough to tell him that someone careful had passed through the space, someone who knew what they were looking for and what they were willing to leave behind. Caleb closed the garage door and leaned against it, exhaling slowly. The events of the night replayed in fragments. The clearing, the empty metal box, a calm voice in the darkness, the sudden arrival of flashing lights. It felt less like a memory and more like a sequence of images borrowed from someone else's life. Inside the house, his phone vibrated again. He flinched, then steadied and entered, closing the door behind him. The screen lit up with a number he now recognized not by contact but by repetition. This time there was no message, only a missed call. He stared at it, then powered the phone off completely and left it on the counter. The silence that followed was dense, almost physical. Later that morning a black sedan stopped in front of his house. Caleb watched from the window, his body tensing automatically until he recognized the woman who stepped out. The senior investigator from the night before moved with the same controlled confidence, a folder under her arm. He opened the door before she knocked. "We need to talk," she said. Her gaze drifted briefly past him into the house. "May I come in?" Caleb stepped aside and let her enter. She wasted no time on pleasantries. They sat at the kitchen table, the same place where he had first spread out the documents, though now the surface was bare. "We finished the preliminary analysis," she said, opening the folder. The fridge was modified sometime in the late 1930s. The welds, the materials, the techniques, everything points to that period. It wasn't built for a single job, it was built to last. Caleb nodded slowly. "So it really was a portable safe." "Essentially," she replied. "The person who built it understood something important. If you guard something valuable too closely, people notice. But if you hide it in plain sight, wrapped in something mundane, it can pass through decades untouched." She slid a photograph across the table. It showed the interior of the fridge, the cavity exposed, the packages carefully stacked. "The money you found," she continued, "was a portion of the ransom diverted before the official drop. The map you discovered wasn't the only one. but it was the most complete. It corrected earlier mistakes. Whoever kept it was meticulous and deeply fearful. Fear of betrayal? Caleb said. Exactly, she answered. The accomplice knew that if the main perpetrators were caught, he would be next. So he spread the risk. Part of the money went to the drop, part went into the fridge. The map was the insurance, the proof, the leverage. Caleb looked at the table. And the man from the clearing? She hesitated. His grandfather was the accomplice. He inherited the secret, she continued, not the money itself, but the knowledge that something was still out there. The fridge passed through several hands over the years. Inheritances, storage units. It finally ended up in that garage. When it was sold, he panicked. That's when he started watching you. And the anonymous tip? Caleb asked. She met his eyes. We believe it came from someone else in the family. A fracture. Disagreements about what to do with the secret. Fear that he would make a mistake. Caleb leaned back, absorbing it all. So it was only a matter of time. Yes, she said quietly. You just happened to be the one who opened the door. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of generations pressing into the small kitchen. What happens now? Caleb asked. The remaining evidence has been secured, she said. The map, the documents, the money, the empty container at the site confirms the timeline we suspected but could never prove. The case will be formally closed. And he, she said, will be charged, not for the original crime, but for obstruction, threats, and interference with a federal investigation. It won't bring anyone back, but it will end the inheritance of fear. She stood and gathered her folder. You'll be mentioned in the report, she added. Your cooperation was crucial. Caleb walked her to the door. When she left, the house felt quieter than before, as if something central had been removed along with the danger. The news of the discovery spread 2 days later. Caleb saw it first online, then on television. The headline spoke of a cold case finally solved, of ransom money hidden for nearly a century, of a casual purchase at a garage sale that changed everything. His name appeared briefly, then disappeared, replaced by broader language about a private citizen. Neighbors began looking at him differently. Some asked questions he didn't answer, others avoided him completely. Reporters came once, then again, then stopped when it became clear he had nothing more to say. The fridge was removed by the authorities the following week. Watching it loaded onto a flatbed truck, Caleb felt a strange mix of relief and loss. It had been a thread, a burden, but also the catalyst for something larger than his own life. When the truck drove away, the garage felt strangely empty. Time passed. Slowly the tension eased. The messages stopped. The feeling of being watched faded into memory. Caleb returned to his routines, though they no longer felt as solid as before. He still visited garage sales, still fixed broken things, but with a new awareness of how easily the ordinary could conceal the extraordinary. One afternoon, months later, he stood in the garage looking at the faint rust stain that remained on the concrete where the fridge had been. It would fade eventually, erased by use and time, but for now it remained as a silent marker. Caleb understood then that the story had never really been about the money. It was about fear passed down like an inheritance, about secrets kept too long, about the fragile illusion that the past could be controlled if hidden well enough. He turned off the light and closed the garage door. The sound echoed softly in the quiet. Inside, the house life continued, ordinary and unremarkable, exactly as it should be. Somewhere, in archives and evidence rooms, the truth now rested in folders and files, finally at peace. And Caleb, an accidental witness, carried forward the knowledge that the most dangerous things were often the ones everyone had learned to ignore. This story kept you hooked until the end. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. New stories are arriving and some go even deeper than this one. Watch the next video on the channel to see how ordinary discoveries turn into shocking truths.